Welcome back to Unfolding Wings, the greatest podcast out there. At least if you're looking for podcasts made by young adults and for young adults, so that we might live faithfully in our own way, in the way that we find meaningful and that God is calling us to live, not just the way that previous generations are trying to tell us to live. And we come back to this podcast to continue a conversation began in our last episode on gun violence and gun ownership. Please do check out part one of gun violence and ownership. That is episode 18 before you listen to this one. Because in that episode, we covered some of the data and recent history of gun violence in our country, as well as the philosophy and theology concerning the Second Amendment. Now, here in this episode, episode 19, part two of gun violence and ownership, we'll be talking about the initial reasons people may have for owning a gun, as well as how to address gun violence. Now, I keep saying we and us, even though I am again recording this by myself, because I am working on putting together a team and making sure that at least two people are present recording each episode. But these things take time. Life changes. As any young adult can tell you, we're not always certain what life is going to bring us. We are changing jobs at a rate not seen before, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. When life throws us curveballs, we are trying to find the blessings in it all. And that's what we on this podcast are doing as well. Now, again, I will remind us that I and we on this podcast do not necessarily represent the views of our church, whatever church we're a part of, nor do we represent the views of young adults generally. Though we do have opinions, and I've structured this episode so that our opinions have the last word, you might say, and perhaps every episode is structured that way. We, first of all, can't speak for every young adult, and secondly, we do want to give space to all views, especially on the subject, because the purpose of our Unfolding Wings podcast is to give a space to young adults they don't normally get in public, perhaps especially in church, to explore ideas and practices so that they can unfold their own wings in the unique way that God calls them to. So, all right, we covered a lot of ground in episode 18, part one of this subject. So, we're going to dig in to another set of questions, beginning with, well, why do people own guns really? And this is a more complicated question than you might imagine, especially if you don't own a gun. But even if you do, there are a wide variety of reasons that people own a gun in the first place. For some people, it is because they are hunting. I have a neighbor, as well as having an uncle, who want to hunt not just because they enjoy it, but truly because they need it, because it is a cost-effective and also environmentally friendly way to provide meat. I remember having a friend in my first church appointment as well, for whom hunting was an important and somewhat necessary way to supplement their income. So for some people, that is the reason why they own a gun, and the guns that they own would prove that to you. Another reason why people might own a gun is, especially you'll hear this reason from single women who want to protect themselves, even if they don't live alone and want to protect themselves. Some people do so to protect their family. I've heard as well that people don't think that they can wait for the police if there is a break-in in their home, especially an armed break-in. In rural areas, especially, this makes sense. Dangerous neighborhoods, too. In a previous lifetime before I became a pastor, I tutored at a home of someone who did shoot and kill a person who broke into their home and was either high on drugs or drunk or just deranged to begin with. He had a knife and was going to hurt them if they didn't have that gun. So that's another reason. Now, there's the reverse argument to that as well, of course, which is that if no one can access a gun, then you might not need one yourself, or at least the feeling that you need one yourself to protect yourself would certainly diminish. Now, there are other less legitimate reasons to owning a gun, I suppose. Hopefully, this is okay that I mentioned my mother. Hopefully, it's okay with her. I mean, uh, is that the world is going to end, and that we're going to need to arm ourselves for that eventuality. Now, is that ultimately the reason for many people? I hope not. I hope that we're not arming ourselves because we think the world is going to end or all government is going to collapse suddenly and entirely throughout the world. But it speaks to a fear that perhaps is the motivating factor for some people. Just recently, of course, there was the drive to buy guns when Biden was elected because people were convinced by the rhetoric that Biden was going to take away our guns. So there's that underlying fear that if we don't have a gun now, then something terrible is going to happen. And there are probably other reasons as well. I'm sure there are, but even within those three reasons that I've listed, there are a variety of different ways of looking at them. But I would say that some of these are more legitimate than others for why we own a gun or some other deadly weapon. And so there are some, we might say, less legitimate reasons. Another reason that people give, and we're going to talk more about this, but another reason that people give is that owning a gun and being able to carry it around even will fix gun violence. So let's turn to that idea now because really that's the whole point of having this conversation is whether or not guns will fix gun violence or whether or not gun control or some version of it will fix gun violence. After episode 18, part 1 of this conversation, someone commented on the podcast page and I'll be honest, at first I was super excited because we haven't gotten an official public comment on our podcast page yet. We've gotten comments through Facebook and such from our own personal friends, but never have we gotten a public comment on the podcast page from someone that we don't know. But then the comment was, there is no gun violence in all caps with multiple exclamation points. And I just have to say, I couldn't believe it. That comment is ridiculous. Just objectively speaking, it is ridiculous. As I talked about in part 1 of this conversation, gun violence is on the rise. There's no question about that. It's obvious. You can't turn on the news or read the news or just go out and live your life and not know that on occasion, at least, some people are dying because of gun violence. So we can't say there is no gun violence. Now, in my calmer moments, I reflected that perhaps what the commenter meant was that guns don't kill people, people kill people. We hear that often, right? I think the first time I encountered that idea was in Happy Gilmore, the movie, the large man who ends up running Shooter McGavin out of the movie at the end. I believe in that last episode, that last scene, that he's wearing a shirt that says, "Guns don't kill people, people kill people." But to that I say, people use guns to kill people. So what do we do about that? Now, some people say that if we gun up, people won't feel safe to commit attacks. That's, again, the general idea that having a gun and being able to carry it around will fix gun violence. Part of this idea is that, well, if a shooter starts attacking, then someone who has a gun will be able to immediately shoot the shooter. Trying to arm teachers, for instance, is this philosophy. You might not stop the attack completely, but at least you will stop it early. Now, you then have to arm everyone, and because what happens if the one or two people who happen to have a gun in a public place are the first ones to be shot? Then what are you going to do? But also, if everyone is now armed, then how are you going to tell who's the original shooter? It could become chaos. We can also tell from recent experiences, some recent attacks, that arming people isn't necessarily a deterrent to those who want to commit gun violence. The Kansas City parade attack just a couple of months ago was committed with a heavy police presence all around. The Parkland shooting, which is famous not just because it was one of the worst school shootings, but also because it started this conversation of what point is there of arming teachers or arming people generally to stop gun violence? Because the Parkland school in Florida had a security guard. And we could say, as many people did, well, that security guard was a coward. He should never have been the security guard. He should have gone in earlier. He could have saved a lot of lives. But his defense was reasonable. We can't know what we're going to do or what anyone is going to do in that situation. We might freeze up, or we might want clarity before we take any possibly violent action of our own. The Boston Marathon bombing as well, another instance, the Las Vegas shooting. All of these are cases where heavy police presence or someone armed was around. So it's clear, it should be clear anyway, as far as I'm concerned, that having guns around doesn't seem to stop anyone, especially because we have more guns per capita in this country than any other country. We have about 3 times the number of guns per capita in this country than the second leading country. And we also have the most gun violence. So having guns doesn't reduce gun violence. It seems, statistically speaking, it just increases the chances of people having a gun and committing violence. So there is that idea, that argument out there that if I'm allowed to carry a gun wherever I go, I will protect people. And if we then apply that to everyone, we'll be safe. But again, that doesn't seem to be working unless we think that the police who have been at these events just aren't doing their jobs. But if that's true, then how are we supposed to expect people who haven't been properly trained to do better? Now, another argument of how we should address gun violence in this country is that rather than gun control, we should affect a moral transformation. Part of this argument is that we need to do something about mental health, but I'm going to come back to mental health. But people will say things like we need to turn back to God as a country. We need to teach one another how to love rather than hate. And it's not about gun control. It's not about forcing people to do something or to not do something, in this case, to not own a gun. And on some level, I agree with this argument. I am, theologically speaking, a libertarian. I am a Christian anarchist. And what that means is that I don't believe it is good or right to force anyone else to believe or to do something. The best way to ensure that someone is a disciple of Christ, as far as I'm concerned, is to make sure that they have chosen it on their own and that you haven't forced them or caged them into making certain decisions that then look like they're being a disciple of Christ. The only way to ensure that we are truly and fully a disciple of Christ is to choose it fully on our own. And if anyone comes to us and says, well, you can't do this or that, and then we listen to them, then we've actually reduced our freedom, even if they're right. Even if they're right in saying to be a disciple of Christ, you can't swear, for instance. And not that that's a major factor of living is whether or not we swear. But even if it's true that it's a terrible sin to swear, if someone comes around and says, well, you can't believe in Christ, you can't follow Christ and swear and curse, especially not like a sailor. Well, fine, but if I then don't swear because someone told me that I shouldn't in order to be a disciple of Christ, then my freedom has been reduced and my ability to choose God on my own goes down, which then means that the actual my actual openness to Christ and the Spirit has gone down. A part of me has closed off itself to the Spirit. We need to remain completely open and completely free to choose the Spirit so that it can then enter into us and transform us on its own, so that we can stop swearing, not because someone told us not to, but because God made us not swear, right? That the Spirit of God in us, the Spirit of God that we have chosen, has transformed us so that we no longer swear. This is a morality of character rather than uh, an ethics of character rather than a morality or ethics of what is it called? I forget the word I was just looking for, but it's not a morality or ethics of determining what's right and wrong for one another. This is essentially just saying that God will give us the character that defines a good disciple. So I really agree with that theologically. So if the idea is let's not do gun control, let's just try and make sure that every person in this country and in the world is being defined and transformed by God and God's Spirit, then to that I say, great. But, but the thing is, moral transformation, inward transformation, does still lead to practical change, right? So I'm not saying about the swearing that we shouldn't let people tell me or to tell you, don't swear as a disciple of Christ, because it's bad to tell one another what to do or what not to do. What I'm saying is that we need to be able to choose the transformation on our own, but there is still some transformation. We talk about racism. Well, that's an obvious ill and evil in our society that we need to erase. And imagine if people responded to the civil rights movement by saying, well, let's just change our hearts and minds, but let's keep the Jim Crow laws, let's keep segregated schools that receive significantly less funding, it doesn't make sense. Because if your hearts and minds were truly changed, you would no longer want to keep the Jim Crow laws or segregated schools, right? So it doesn't make sense to say, let's keep the focus on moral and inward transformation, which again, I agree with, that's a good focus, but it doesn't make sense to keep the focus on that without ever talking about the practical change. At some point, there should be a practical change. There should be a hoped for outcome. And it's not just that, well, people will continue buying guns and owning guns, they just won't use them. It would be, well, because there is a practical inward transformation in people, no one will feel like they need a gun anymore because everyone will know that we're safe. So it's true in a sense that guns don't kill people. You can't just have uh, a a gun come to life and decide to shoot bullets that it loaded in itself. People are the ones who use the guns, but certainly guns participate. A lot of research that I have read shows that most people with easy access to guns are also connected to white male supremacist ideas. So, on that score, yeah, we need a moral transformation in our country because having white supremacists or male supremacists running around isn't great. But here's the thing is that those same people who are spouting off this idea that we need to focus on the transformation, the moral transformation, and not on the gun control laws, tend to be those who lean towards white or male supremacist ideas in the first place. So I don't really trust anyone who essentially is just trying to protect their own way of living. And in other words, to say, I want to be able to own a gun, but because I trust myself, but I don't want everyone else to be able to own a gun if they're going to kill people with it. But how can you trust even yourself, really? I mean, ultimately, because everyone is going to say to themselves, well, I'm not going to do that until something happens in life, and then you suddenly become that person. So, again, yeah, we need a transformation. We need a moral transformation of people in this country. There's no question about that. No question about that. But part of that transformation, it seems clear to me, needs to lead to owning fewer guns. I mean, I can't understand how we've gotten to the situation that we are in if owning guns isn't directly related to gun violence. And if there's something wrong with a society that wants to own more guns when owning guns is clearly related to gun violence, right? The issue is that our society seems obsessed with owning guns. Now, you may, again, may be one of those people who want to own a gun for a legitimate reason, but it does seem pretty clear that we are obsessed with owning guns. There's something wrong with that. Not every country is. And also, not every country is dealing with the level of gun violence and mass shootings that we are. So, if we're going to say that we should focus on moral transformation rather than gun control, we need to be honest with ourselves, first of all, that we just don't want to change. That's ultimately what we're saying. Because if we were serious, then we would also admit that a moral transformation would lead to gun control. Here's another thing. Many deaths are suicides. Deaths by guns, I should say, are suicides. Now, suicides are a journey. They can be contemplated over many months, but often suicides are a sudden or a temporary decision. And I'm not saying that in all cases, and almost always, even if it is a sudden or temporary decision, it is made at the culmination of a long journey. But if in that sudden or temporary decision someone says, well, I can get a gun in a few days and be rid of this pain, whatever pain we may be talking about, that's a problem. Because if they had more time, they might be able to get the help that they need, the support that they need. And so again, we come to mental health here because if we say we want greater mental health advocacy, then changing gun laws is also a part of it. Because to get people the mental health support that they need, our mental health system is a disaster right now. And so while even if it's not a disaster, I mean, it takes time to get doctor's appointments. It's not just like you can go in that particular day in all cases and get all the wraparound services that you need. It takes time. And if it's faster, getting a gun and shooting yourself, then we have a problem again. So changing gun laws is a part of mental health advocacy to make sure that no one is making a sudden or temporary decision to end their life. Now, also, I should say that saying mental health is the problem, it's often a distraction. It's just like the moral transformation argument in the sense that it is for many people a way to put off doing anything because those who say, the real issue is mental health, well, what are they doing to increase mental health treatment availability? I don't see anyone doing anything to make that happen. I feel as if essentially people who say mental health is the problem, we need to get better mental health advocacy for people, they're just saying it so that they can divert attention from the real issue. And then they wait until news coverage of that particular shooting has died down so that they can do nothing. Why is the mental health system still an absolute mess if that's the solution that we hear most often from gun rights advocates? So then we might talk about what laws might actually help address gun violence, if any. Which laws should be seriously considered about gun control or mental health or anything else? Now, this is where I wish I had a guest or co-host with me tonight as I record this episode because I am in the moral transformation camp. And so I don't have great answers for this, except I do just personally, generally support greater gun control because I do think that is the ultimate goal of whatever our moral transformation is going to be. There is one possible law that I would suggest, however, and it's based on the fact that um, the Kansas City parade attack, Sandy Hook, the Virginia Tech shooting, many school shootings. In fact, I believe most, if not all, school shootings are perpetrated by juveniles or very young adults, people under the age of 25. in many cases for school shootings, people under the age of 22. And it's strange that someone can own and operate a gun or a bow and arrow, even. But that's another conversation. But someone can own and operate a gun essentially at the age of 16, possibly even younger, because we have those hunting days for minors. Now, obviously, that's under supervision and all, and it's hunting is, I think, a legitimate reason for owning a gun. But still, that's legal when the legal alcohol age is 21 because people under 21 apparently can't be trusted. You can't drive a car even under supervision until 16, even though those things are dangerous, man. I mean, I can't tell you how many people that I suspect are young adults most often, but not always. How many times I see people coming towards me, a swerving down the road, and as I pass them, I see them looking down at their phones. 16 under supervision for driving a car because they can't be trusted. 25 to rent a car because people under the age of 25 can't be trusted to rent a car and keep it in good condition. But it's 18 to own a gun, to buy a gun. Sometimes you can just walk away essentially with a gun at the age of 18 when you can't be trusted with these other things. And again, younger than that to operate one, it doesn't make sense. To me, we should, as far as I'm concerned, have a law that if you are under the age of 25, you either can't own a gun or you have to wait a year to get the gun that you apply for. In addition to that, talking about cars, you've probably heard this before. There are resources and training that are required for people to get their driver's license. Right? There's driver's education. Even with alcohol, there are classes that are offered. I remember being at college and it wasn't a class, but it was a little workshop on how to handle your alcohol. Because the school didn't want you to drink, but it knew that you were probably going to try. So it offered resources and training for how to be responsible. But when it comes to owning a gun, in most places, you don't need to have training. You can just go and buy a gun. There need to be, as far as I'm concerned, there need to be resources and training required for gun owners. And then there need to be resources and training to ensure that the guns that people own are going to be locked up and protected. I think we can also address possible laws for and stricter laws for people who are known abusers, domestic or sexual abusers. Now, this is difficult for me because I believe in redemption. I believe in grace. So I don't think that people who have been convicted of a crime once should be judged for all time for it. Uh, that when it comes to churches, we're supposed to have safe sanctuary policies, or at least it's a Methodist thing. I don't know what other denominations might call it, but essentially the idea that if there are children around, you need to have at least two adults, right? And we talk about what are the requirements and what are the background checks that we need to do on anyone who's going to be working with our kids. Well, first of all, oftentimes those background checks can be more intensive than they are for guns, but That aside, most churches put into their safe sanctuary policy that anyone who is a known abuser or sexual abuser can't work with their kids. And there's no time limit on it. It's just if you have a record of that, then you can't work with the church's kids. I don't agree with that. I'll be honest. I don't agree with that. I think if a person is filled with the grace of God, has been converted, is born again, whatever we want to say, then they're different now. That that's for working with kids with another adult present, though. Now, when we're talking about guns that can end someone's life in flash of an eye, or whatever, what is that phrase? I'm not good with phrases, common phrases. Don't ask me common phrases. I used to say, I'll kill a bird with two stones. Or whatever that flash, blink of an eye. That's what we're going for. All right. What was I even saying? So with guns, if you are an abuser, uh, there should be stricter rules. And the reason I say that is because you can't be observed all of the time. You can't be with another person who's going to ensure that you act safely, as the case in a church's safe sanctuaries policy. The other person that you are most likely going to be with is the person that you are abusing. So we should take away your ability to use deadly force against the person that you are abusing. And oftentimes, abuse isn't just physical or violent, it's also mental. Or having the option for deadly force can be a significant form of abuse to your significant other or whoever it is the person is abusing. Right? The threat of shooting you is serious. I had a friend while I was in seminary who was in an abusive relationship, was afraid of leaving, but knew she had to. And she ended up leaving. She felt so much better for about a week. And then she started saying things about how she was afraid. And I offered to, or I was about to offer her a place to stay safely for a little while, but I figured, I'm 10 hours away. Surely someone closer to her will realize the danger and will help her out. Next thing I know, 48 hours later, she's been murdered by her ex. And that threat of violence had been held over her for a long time. It's why she didn't leave sooner. And then the threat is fulfilled. And so we can't just look at the actual statistics of gun violence to know the the full extent of the violence that gun ownership does in our society, because oftentimes it is just the threat of the violence in abusive relationships that can cause significant harm to people's lives. So, yes, I do believe people who are known abusers shouldn't be able to own any weapon of any kind. I don't care how long it's been. And maybe it's just because I know that a beautiful person in this world was taken away from us. So those are at least some laws that I think we can start looking at. Now, all of this, I want to come back to Jesus. I want to end on this note. What would Jesus actually want us to do here? What does Jesus expect us to do? This is ultimately a podcast for people trying to live faithfully and try to understand how God is calling us to live faithfully. What would unfolding our wings mean for us, faithfully speaking? And I think it's pretty clear that Jesus would expect us to put away our weapons. Now, the scene when Jesus is arrested is a little ambiguous, and some other things that Jesus says are a little ambiguous because Jesus tells the disciple, it's often understood to be Peter, but it's not necessarily clear. But he tells the disciple who drew his sword as if one disciple with one sword was going to prevent Jesus from being arrested. But Jesus says, put away your sword. People who kill by the sword will be killed by the sword. Don't do it. But the thing is the disciple still had the sword in the first place. Surely Jesus knew that the disciple had the sword. Can't really hide that very well. Now, there's a whole contextual historical lesson I could do on the Jewish sect of zealots here. They're essentially undercover uh, rebels who may or may not have carried swords around with themselves under their robes. And so while you're walking around and in public, perhaps you can hide the sword well under your robe, under your cloak. It's a flowy garment. But at the end of the day, when you're getting ready for bed, Jesus and the disciples seem to have been together all the time. I don't know. I think Jesus knew that the disciple had the sword. So why didn't Jesus say early on to stop carrying that sword around, man? It's not good. I don't want it. Maybe it's because Jesus just didn't want him to use the sword in that particular moment. Similar to when Jesus says to Pilate, I could call down legions of angels right now to prevent me from being crucified, but I'm not going to because the prophecies need to be fulfilled. Well, is Jesus saying that he's going to call the legions of angels down at some other time? Just this isn't the right time because he needs to die on the cross? What is it really? Well, I think the clearest answer, and I am in agreement with the scholar John Howard Yoder in this respect. The clearest answer, I think, of what Jesus really meant to say to us about violence, committing violence, and being, possible causes of violence and carrying weapons and all of that is what the early church did and believed. You would think that the people closest to Jesus in time as well as in presence would know what Jesus really wanted and expected. As with any movement, as time goes by, things might get tainted, might be changed a little. John Calvin, what he believed was a lot different than what his predecessors say he believed. But the closer you are to John Calvin, the closer you are to the real John Calvin, so to speak. The closer you are to Jesus, the closer you are to the real Jesus, so to speak. And the early church was 100% clear and concise on this issue. Any baptized Christian was not allowed to join the military. And if they did, they would be excommunicated. Any baptized Christian who was already a member of the military at the time of baptism could remain in the military because that's their bread and butter. That's how they're earning their income. But they had to not only request, but enforce their request, which is an amazing thing, enforce their request to not ever be put in a position where they might take away someone else's life, where they might end up having to fight. So, in other words, to enforce the request to never be put in a position where they have to draw a sword. Because the early church was clear in saying that when Jesus said, put away the sword, he meant it for everyone. So the early church, they became martyrs. Those who were in that position, not everyone, of course, but those who were prominent, those who caused problems for the Roman religion and civil religion, they became martyrs. They did not fight back. And Rome was tyrannical. In many ways, they were kind of loosey-goosey. They wouldn't really care how you managed your city or your country as long as you paid your taxes to Rome, as long as you didn't rebel against Rome, and as long as you admitted that Caesar was God. Once they claimed Caesar was God, you had to also. But on that score, if you said Caesar was not God, or you decided you didn't want to pay all your taxes, Rome was tyrannical. Christians chose to never bow the knee to Caesar, to never compromise, and they chose to fight the tyranny of Rome spiritually and morally, but never physically with violence. Against the weight of the violent empire was on the Christians and the weight of God's love. Again, often expressed in martyrdom rather than fighting back. Christians, quite simply, were never armed. Never. That was the early church until Constantine came around and declared Christianity the official religion of Rome, which changed things forever. And we can look throughout Christian history, even after Constantine, for prophets of various kinds who said that ultimately Jesus wants us to be nonviolent. The most famous of which, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We can look at others around the world and history as well. Gandhi with Satyagraha, he was not a Christian, but this idea that individuals being morally and practically changed and transformed, especially in nonviolence, are shining lights. But anyone who claims to be morally transformed but isn't practically and is still committing violence against others or still threatening the possible violence against others isn't going to do much. Right? I mean, most often people, when they reflect on the civil rights movement or lived through it, will highlight Dr. King and negate or um, think poorly of Malcolm X because Malcolm X thought that violence was okay in asserting black rights. Well, if we don't think violence is okay in asserting justice in one case, why do we think it's okay in another case? It should be wrong in all cases. If we think that nonviolence is the correct answer to change society in one case, why do we not think it's the answer in another case? It should be right in all cases. I think I've said enough. Probably a good thing that I didn't have a guest or co-host with us because I can talk about this issue forever. Um, Next time we will almost certainly have someone else with us so you aren't bored by me and my delightful voice. Next time we will be talking about abortion. Another fantastic topic. That's all we do is significant and controversial topics on this podcast because these are the things that not just young adults, but all of us are struggling with and trying to figure out how to navigate in our lives and still be faithful in the way that we feel is right. So, hope this was meaningful. Hope this has sparked a lot of thoughtful reflection for you, perhaps conversation as well, as long as it is dignified and respectful conversation with your friends and with yourself as well. But for now, keep it holy until next time.